There's something about camping deep in the Appalachians that changes a person. The silence isn't empty, it listens. The fog isn't just weather, it hides things. And the deeper you go, the less the trail seems to lead back out. Tonight, I'm sharing 10 of the most chilling true camping horror stories ever whispered from these mountains. These aren't ghost tales by the fire. These are real encounters from real people who made it back to tell the tale. If you love true horror stories like this, hit that like button. It helps this story reach more horror lovers like you. And tell me where you're watching from. Every viewer is part of my horror family, and I want to know where my family is tuning in. And don't forget, subscribing helps us keep bringing you terrifying stories like these. I grew up in a small town on the edge of the Appalachians, but I never spent much time deep in the woods. They always felt endless to me. Too quiet, too heavy with old stories my grandfather used to tell. But when my friend Mason suggested a weekend camping trip, I said yes. I'd been working long weeks and thought maybe the air out there would clear my head. We hiked in late September when the air turned sharp and the leaves had that brittle crunch underfoot. The trail was narrow and half swallowed by roots, winding through valleys that dipped so low the sunlight barely reached us. Mason had been there before and said he knew of a spot near an old logging road where we could camp undisturbed. By the time we reached it, dusk was settling like smoke. The place was quiet in a way I can't really explain, like even the crickets had forgotten how to make noise. The ground was soft with rotting leaves, and the remains of an old cabin leaned against the hillside, its roof collapsed, boards gray with age. We set up our tent, a short distance from it, close enough to hear the wood creak when the wind shifted. After dinner, we sat by a small fire. Mason dozed off early, his body stretched out like he didn't have a care in the world. I stayed awake, watching the fog roll low through the trees. It moved strangely, like something alive, wrapping itself around the stumps and rocks until everything seemed unfamiliar. I finally crawled into the tent around midnight. The nylon walls glowed faintly with the dying fire outside, and I lay there listening to Mason's breathing. I might have been drifting toward sleep when I heard it, soft at first, like the air was carrying it from far away. A whistle, a simple tune, no words, just 3 notes, repeated over and over. The sound was slow, almost thoughtful, like whoever was making it had no reason to rush. My eyes snapped open, and I froze. Mason stirred, but didn't wake. The whistling grew clearer, closer, and I realized it was just outside the tent. I held my breath, waiting for footsteps, twigs breaking, something, but there was nothing. Only that tune, looping again and again. Finally, I couldn't stand it. I unzipped the tent just a few inches and peered out. The sound stopped. The woods looked the same as they had earlier, fog curling at the base of the trees, the coals of the fire glowing faintly red. No movement, no figures, nothing but silence pressing down on everything. I waited, my heart thudding, but the whistling didn't return. Eventually, I zipped the tent back up, telling myself it was some hunter or hiker, maybe just passing through. Still, I barely slept the rest of the night, my ears straining at every noise. In the morning, I stepped out and nearly tripped. All around our tent, arranged in a perfect circle, were little stacks of stones. Each one was about the size of a fist, balanced carefully on top of the other, some leaning at precarious angles, like they shouldn't have been able to stand at all. There had to be at least 20 of them, evenly spaced, encircling the camp, like someone had been working silently all night. I looked at Mason. He stared at them, his face pale. "You didn't do this, did you?" he asked. I shook my head. Neither of us said much else, but something in the woods felt heavier that morning, like the air itself was watching us. We didn't pack up right away. Mason laughed it off, though I could see the tightness in his jaw. "Probably just kids screwing around," he said, but there weren't any houses for miles, no towns, no roads but the overgrown logging path we'd taken in. Still, we tried to go about the day as if nothing had happened. We hiked a little, cooked some food, but I couldn't stop staring at those stones. They weren't random. Whoever placed them had taken their time. Each stack pointed inward, facing our tent, like we'd been at the center of something. That night, the fog came back thick and wet, soaking the leaves until the ground squished beneath our boots. The cabin by the hillside moaned with the wind, boards shifting like old bones. Mason built the fire higher than before, and we sat close. Neither of us admitted it, but we didn't want to go in the tent yet. Around midnight, it started again. That whistle, 3 notes, slow, careful, over and over. Mason stood up fast, his flashlight cutting through the mist, but the sound seemed to move with the beam, always just beyond reach, circling us. "Who's out there?" he shouted. His voice echoed off the valley walls, but the whistling didn't stop. Then, just as suddenly as the night before, it cut off. The silence that followed felt worse. I could hear my own blood in my ears. We doused the fire and got into the tent, neither of us speaking. Mason eventually fell asleep, but I lay awake, staring at the fabric wall, waiting. At some point, exhaustion pulled me under. When I woke at dawn, Mason was gone. His sleeping bag lay open, his boots missing from where he'd left them. I scrambled outside, my breath clouding in the morning air. The stones were back, another circle, but this time tighter, closer to the tent, so close I had to step over them to get out. And in the space where Mason had slept, a small pile of freshly turned earth, not big, just enough to look deliberate. I called his name until my throat was raw. No answer. No sign of him on the trail. No footprints in the wet ground. Just the fog and that old cabin, slumping against the hillside. I never found him. When I finally made it back to town and told the sheriff, he looked at me like I was crazy. They searched for a week. Dogs, volunteers, the whole thing, but they didn't find a trace. No Mason, no stone circles, nothing. Sometimes I dream about that night. I'll be half asleep, and I'll hear those 3 notes, soft and patient, waiting just beyond the dark, and I always wake up with the taste of damp earth in my mouth. I don't know if it was foolishness or pride that led me that deep into the Appalachian backcountry alone, but either way, I can't undo what I saw out there. I'd driven up an old fire road that barely looked like a road anymore, more like a washed-out trail littered with rocks and water ruts. The truck groaned every time I nudged it forward. Around me, fog clung to the trees like smoke, and the ridges rose up in dark layers, folding into one another until I couldn't tell where the sky ended. I'd been working construction jobs non-stop that summer, and all I wanted was one weekend to myself. No phones, no noise, just silence. I found a flat spot near the end of the fire road and pitched my tent, maybe 100 feet off the trail, tucked between 2 crooked poplars. The forest was wet, heavy with the smell of rot and pine. Even the birds seemed quiet. I tried to tell myself I liked the isolation, but the longer I sat there, the more I noticed how still everything was. When the wind shifted, I caught faint whiffs of something sour, like old smoke or mildew. The fire ring nearby looked like it hadn't been used in years, just broken bottles and rusted cans buried in the dirt. As night fell, I lit a small fire and ate from a can of chili. The woods creaked around me, but it was the kind of sound you expect: owls calling, branches groaning. Normal. I crawled into my tent and tried to sleep, listening to the rain starting to patter on the nylon. I don't know what time it was when I woke. The fire had burned out, and the forest was black. What pulled me from sleep wasn't the rain. It was the sound of leaves crunching. Slow, deliberate steps, close enough that I thought maybe a deer had wandered near. I held still, listening. The steps circled, not hurried, not afraid, just pacing. Then I heard it. A low voice, barely above a whisper. He's awake. Every muscle in my body locked. I held my breath, heart hammering so loud I thought they'd hear it. There wasn't supposed to be anyone out here. I hadn't seen a single car or hiker the whole drive in. I didn't move. I didn't unzip the tent. I just lay there in the dark, staring at the thin fabric as the rain tapped harder above me. The footsteps slowed, then stopped. For the rest of the night, I stayed like that, frozen, every sound amplified. The groan of trees, the drip of water, what I thought was the faint sound of breathing just outside the nylon wall. Somehow, the gray light of dawn finally came. My body was stiff, my mouth dry, but I forced myself to unzip the tent and step out. The forest smelled of wet leaves and smoke again, heavy. Now the ground was soft with mud, and that's when I saw them, boot prints, fresh, circling my tent in messy loops. There were two different sets, one heavy deep into the mud, one smaller, lighter, but just as clear. They overlapped, weaving around each other. I stood there, the cold air biting my face, trying to make sense of it, but the only thing I could feel was the silence pressing in, thicker than before. I packed up quickly that morning. My hands shook as I rolled the tent, and every sound of branches snapping in the distance made me whip my head around. The boot prints didn't just circle my tent, they trailed off into the woods, vanishing into the mist. I kept staring at them, as though I could figure out who they belonged to just by looking. One pair had tread marks like work boots, the kind with deep ridges. The other was smoother, almost like sneakers. They weren't old, they were sharp, defined. From the night before, my first thought was to leave immediately, but the fire road was rough, and I knew rushing would only get me stuck. So I forced myself to move carefully, methodically, load the pack, shoulder it. Don't think, just move. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. The forest seemed wrong in daylight, too pale, the fog thick as milk between the trees. I tried to listen for birds, for anything alive, but the woods gave nothing back. Only silence, and the soft squelch of my boots in the mud. When I reached the truck, I found something that made my chest go tight. On the driver's side window, just above the handle, was a smear. Mud, human hand-shaped, like someone had gripped the glass with dirty fingers. I opened the door slowly. The inside was untouched, but the smell hit me. Wet earth and sweat, faint but present. I drove out of there shaking so hard I could barely keep the wheel steady. Every bend in the road, every shadow on the ridge, I expected to see someone standing there. But the worst part didn't come until weeks later. I'd been back home, trying to bury the memory, telling myself maybe I'd imagined the voice, maybe the prints were old, maybe the handprint wasn't what it looked like. You learn to build little lies like that when the truth doesn't make sense. Then one night, scrolling through a local forum about camping spots in Appalachia, I found a thread about that same fire road. A man had posted pictures from a hunting trip the year before. In one photo, you could see the exact same clearing, where I'd pitched my tent, only, in his shot, there was something I hadn't seen. An old collapsed shack, maybe 20 yards back into the trees, barely standing, covered in vines. I don't know how I missed it, whether the fog had hidden it, or I'd just been too focused on my camp. But the thought of it has eaten at me ever since. Because in the comments under that post, people mentioned things I hadn't known, about squatters living out there, about folks finding gutted deer carcasses, and once, even a burned mattress dragged into the hollow. I try not to think about the voice. I try not to imagine two people standing in the rain outside of my tent, circling, whispering. But every time I close my eyes, I see those prints again, two sets, winding around me, like they were studying how I slept. And I wonder if the only reason I ever made it out of that hollow was because one of them told the other to wait. I've always loved the Appalachian Mountains. Though in hindsight, maybe I only loved the idea of them. To me, they represented quiet, untouched forests, creeks you could drink straight from, air that carried no hint of smoke or exhaust. So when my friend Ethan suggested we camp near a creek he'd found off an old trail, I agreed without hesitation. It was late October, the kind of weather where the nights cut through your jacket, but the days were warm enough to make you forget winter was coming. There were 4 of us, me, Ethan, his girlfriend Leah, and our mutual friend Marcus. We'd parked along a dirt service road outside an old town called Withville, then hiked 2 hours into the valley. The creek was exactly as Ethan promised. Narrow, clear, bordered by tall poplars and maples already stripped bare. Their branches clawed at a gray sky, and the entire place smelled of wet earth and rotting leaves. We set up camp in a small clearing, where the ground dipped slightly, close enough to hear the creek's steady trickle, but far enough not to risk flooding if it rained. By the time night fell, the woods had gone impossibly quiet. No insects, no owls, just the water and the occasional groan of shifting branches. I remember thinking it felt too quiet. Around the fire, we tried to make it feel normal. Jokes, cheap whiskey, Leah humming along to a song on Marcus's phone. But the fire didn't hold the darkness back the way I expected. Every time I glanced at the tree line, it felt like the woods were pressing in, inching closer. By 2 in the morning, the fire had burned down to glowing coals. Marcus was passed out in his sleeping bag. Ethan and Leah had retreated into their tent, leaving me staring at the embers. I was about to crawl into my own tent when something caught my eye. A soft flickering light between the trees. It looked exactly like the glow of a lantern. Dim, yellowish. It drifted between the trunks, slow and deliberate. At first, I thought maybe another camper had wandered into our stretch of woods. But there were no voices, no sound of boots cracking twigs. Just that lone, bobbing light. I froze. The lantern didn't move closer. It just circled, wide arcs through the trees, always at the edge of visibility, like someone was pacing around us, but never stepping into the clearing. Every few minutes it would disappear, only to reappear again in another patch of darkness. After 10 minutes, I whispered for Ethan. He groggily unzipped his tent, clearly annoyed, until he saw the light. Then he went still, crouched halfway out, watching. Leah joined him, her face pale in the dim glow. None of us said much. The only thing Ethan muttered was, "That's not right." We stayed like that until near dawn. The light circled for hours, steady and patient, until the first gray streaks of morning cut across the valley. Then it simply vanished. When we finally worked up the nerve to check, the ground was undisturbed. No footprints, no sign of a campfire or lantern. Nothing. I wanted to leave right then, but Ethan convinced us to stay one more night. He said maybe it had just been some hunter, someone who didn't want to stumble into our camp. Maybe. But as I sat by the creek that morning, the mist rising off the water, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd been watched in a way that had nothing to do with another camper. And that unease, heavy, sour in the gut, only grew stronger as the day wore on. The second day felt heavier. Even with the sun overhead, the woods seemed dimmer, muted, like the colors had been washed out. We tried to distract ourselves, fished a little, wandered upstream, but every path seemed to loop back to the same clearing, as if the valley didn't want us leaving it. Marcus laughed it off, though his hands shook when he rolled a cigarette. "We're just tired," he kept saying, but his voice cracked when he said it. By dusk the clouds rolled in. The air turned damp and metallic, and the smell of rot carried stronger from the forest floor. We built the fire higher than before, a desperate orange glow against the closing dark. None of us spoke much. I kept scanning the trees, waiting for the lantern, and sure enough, sometime past midnight, it returned. Same faint flicker, same slow circling. Ethan cursed under his breath. Leah started crying quietly. Marcus tried to shout at it, but his voice just echoed against the hollow valley, swallowed by the trees. The lantern never reacted. It stayed all night again, never closer, never farther, just there. By dawn, my nerves were shot. I barely slept. My skin felt electric, like I'd been waiting for something to burst out of the woods. When the gray light finally returned, the lantern was gone once more. But the ground wasn't empty this time. Ethan spotted it first, a small pile of stones stacked near the edge of camp, 3 smooth creek rocks balanced on top of one another. We hadn't built it, none of us had. That was the breaking point. We packed in silence, barely eating, barely speaking. By late morning, we were on the trail back to the car. The hike felt longer than before, as if the woods were stretching. Every sound, the creak of branches, the snap of twigs underfoot, made my pulse spike. We never talked about it after. Not really. A few half-hearted theories passed around. Hunters, squatters, some backwoods prank. but nobody believed their own words. It's been 6 years since that trip. Ethan and Leah broke up not long after. Marcus moved out west, and we don't see each other much anymore. But I still think about that lantern, about how it never came close, how it only circled us like it was patient, like it was waiting. Some nights, when I can't sleep, I'll close my eyes and picture that faint yellow glow bobbing between black trees. And every time, I wonder the same thing. What would have happened if we'd stayed just one more night? I'll never go back to those mountains. But sometimes, when I wake in the middle of the night, I swear I can see a faint flicker of light outside my window, and I never look long enough to know if it's real. I've been back home for months now, but I still can't sleep right. Any small creak in the floorboards, or even the sound of rain tapping on the roof, takes me straight back to that night in the mountains. It was late October when a few of us decided to take a camping trip. I'm not the type who plans things. I was just tagging along. My old friend Mark had found a spot somewhere near the Tennessee-North Carolina line, deep in the Appalachian range. He said it was tucked off a logging road, close to where his uncle used to hunt. By the time we reached the clearing, the sun was already down. The fog had rolled in so thick it looked like smoke clinging to the trees. Everything smelled damp, like wet leaves pressed into rot. The ground squished under my boots when we unloaded the gear, and the forest around us carried that hollow quiet you only hear when you're miles from a highway. We set up camp. Just one fire, 3 tents. Mark kept joking that this was real wilderness, and how no one would ever find us out there. I laughed at the time, but it stuck in my head in a way I didn't like. The first night passed easy enough. Beer, stories, the kind of laughter that keeps you warm when the cold air moves in. But when I finally lay down, the silence pressed harder. Out there, the dark doesn't just surround you, it swallows everything. I don't know what time it was when I woke the first time. The fire had burned low, just glowing coals. That's when I heard it. The faint crunch of leaves just past the circle of light. Someone walking. At first I thought maybe Mark had gotten up to take a piss, but the steps didn't fade away. They kept circling, slow, almost deliberate, like someone pacing. My chest tightened. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped the tent, and flicked the beam into the dark. The sound cut off immediately. Nothing but fog and trees stared back at me. The mist made the light bounce in strange ways, like it didn't want to go far. I listened for a long time, but there was nothing. Just my own pulse in my ears. Finally, I told myself it was probably an animal, zipped back up, and tried to force myself to sleep. But it happened again, and again. Each time the sound of slow footsteps just beyond where I could see. Each time, it stopped the second my flashlight swept the woods. By morning, I was bleary-eyed, half convinced I'd imagined the whole thing. But then we saw them. All around the fire pit, pressed upright into the damp dirt, were matches. Dozens of them, half burned down, as if someone had lit them, let them flame for a second, then stuck them into the ground until they died. None of us had put them there. Mark laughed nervously, tried to say maybe one of us was messing around, but no one admitted to it. I kept looking at those blackened tips, still smelling faintly of sulfur, and felt something in my gut tighten. Whoever had been walking last night hadn't just been passing by, they'd been close enough to light matches and place them one by one in silence while we slept. We tried to shrug it off. Mark made coffee, Anna busied herself with breakfast, and I sat there staring at the little burnt sticks until my stomach churned. The fog hadn't lifted. It clung to the trees, muffling everything. I told myself we'd leave, pack up, go back down the mountain. But no one else seemed ready. Mark said we'd come too far just to turn back over a weird prank. That day we hiked a short trail nearby. The woods were slick with moss, the air heavy with the smell of wet earth. Every so often, I'd catch myself turning, sure I heard something behind us, twigs snapping, leaves shifting. But every time I looked it was just mist and trees. When we returned to camp, I noticed something else. Our fire pit, which we'd left cold, had a small pile of black ash at the center. Fresh ash, like something had been burned there while we were gone. Mark swore no one had been near the site, but I knew what I saw. That night, I barely slept. The footsteps came back, circling, stopping whenever I moved. Sometimes it sounded like 2 sets, sometimes just one. I pressed my ear against the tent floor and thought I could feel the vibration through the ground. At one point, I whispered Mark's name, hoping he was awake. No answer, only the steady crunch of someone walking, deliberate, patient. I couldn't take it anymore. I crawled out, flashlight in hand. The beam cut through fog and hit nothing but dripping branches. But then I saw it, at the far edge of the clearing, another match, freshly burned, smoke still curling from its tip. I swung the light around, my chest locked. Every few feet, surrounding our camp, was another match stuck in the dirt, circling us like some kind of boundary. All of them burned to the halfway point, all of them still faintly glowing red at their tips. I froze. Whoever had lit them was close enough that the sulfur sting hung heavy in the air. But there was no sound now. No footsteps, just silence. I backed toward my tent, every part of me screaming not to turn my light off. My hands shook so bad, I could barely keep the beam steady. The next morning, Mark wanted to laugh it off again, but Anna refused. Her face was pale, her voice sharp. She said we needed to leave, now, so we did. We packed fast, our boots sliding in the mud as we hauled everything back down the logging road. None of us spoke much, just the sound of our breath and the clink of gear. When we reached the truck, I glanced back one last time. The fog still hung heavy, and just at the tree line, barely visible through the mist, I swore I saw the faint glow of a single match burning, before it flickered out. I don't know who was out there, or why they wanted us to know they were so close. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, when I wake to silence, I catch a faint whiff of sulfur in my room, and I can't help but wonder if we really left them behind. I'd been hiking alone through the Blue Ridge section of the Appalachians for 3 days when I came across an old trail marker leaning crooked in the mud. It was nothing more than a splintered wooden post, half rotted, with a faded triangle carved into it. The kind of thing that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. I was tired, and the land flattened out enough nearby to make for a decent camp, so I decided that's where I'd pitch my tent. The air was heavy that evening, the kind of wet Appalachian dusk where every sound carries too far. The cicadas buzzed, but underneath that was the quiet drip of rain rolling off leaves. The soil sucked at my boots as I staked the tent, and the smell of damp earth clung to everything I touched. I ate cold jerky sitting on a rock and watched mist pool in the hollows. Something about the marker unsettled me, though I couldn't say why. Maybe it was the way it tilted, like it had been shoved or dug up. Maybe it was the faint impression of boot tracks around it, though the mud could have been from anyone passing through days before. Still, I told myself not to overthink it. By the time I slid into my sleeping bag, the woods had gone almost unnervingly quiet. No wind, no night birds, no rustle of leaves, just the occasional drip. I dozed in and out, my dreams tangled with the low groans of tree limbs straining against the damp. At some point, I woke up. My phone said it was 3:04 a.m. At first, I didn't know what had disturbed me. Then I heard it. A faint sound right by my head. The zipper of my tent was being pulled. It slid down just a few inches before I snapped upright and shouted, "Hey!" My voice cracked the silence. There was a sharp intake of breath outside, like someone startled, and then fast footsteps tearing off into the trees. Dry leaves crackled, then silence again. I sat there frozen, heart thudding, staring at that half-opened zipper. The damp air rolled in through the gap. I fumbled for my flashlight, but forced myself not to go outside. The dark beyond the nylon suddenly felt enormous. For the rest of the night, I barely slept. Every snapping twig made me jolt. Every creak of the forest seemed deliberate. I kept replaying the sound of the zipper, how slow it had been, like someone trying not to wake me. When gray light finally seeped through the tent walls, I unzipped it the rest of the way and stepped out into the fog. Everything was wet, dripping, pale. The trail marker stood crooked like before, and that's when I saw the log. Just a few feet from where I'd slept, someone had neatly stacked some of my belongings. My knife, my flashlight, and 2 sealed packets of food, all arranged in a tidy little pile, balanced like a display. They hadn't taken anything, just touched it, moved it, and left it where I couldn't miss it. I stared at that pile until my hands started shaking. Whoever had come into my camp last night, they wanted me to know they'd been there, and they wanted me to wonder what they planned to do next. I should have packed up immediately and headed back down the trail, but the Appalachians play tricks on you when you're alone. I told myself it was some random drifter, a kid maybe, just trying to scare me. Nothing stolen, no harm done. I tried to convince myself of that as I forced down breakfast, the taste of oats metallic in my mouth. But the longer I sat there, the less it felt like a prank. The pile hadn't been careless. It was too deliberate. By late morning, the fog began to lift, and I decided I couldn't stand staying in that spot another hour. I stuffed everything into my pack, but when I went to grab my knife, I froze. It wasn't where I'd left it. I found it eventually, stuck blade down in the damp earth near the trail marker. The handle protruded at a perfect angle, like someone had placed it with care. My chest went cold. I hadn't touched it since last night. The hike that day was the longest of my life. Every bend in the trail felt watched. The wet leaves muffled my steps, and the hollows carried sounds I couldn't place, breaking branches, distant coughs, the swish of something moving where I couldn't see. By afternoon, the clouds thickened again, and rain began to patter through the canopy. I kept expecting to catch sight of someone. I never did, only the feeling of being followed. That evening, I didn't stop until my legs trembled. I found an abandoned shack off the trail, half collapsed with a rusting tin roof. The door was gone, the floorboards soft with rot, it stank of mold and wet wood. But it was shelter, and I didn't want to pitch my tent in the rain again. Inside, broken jars littered the corners, and old newspapers were fused into the floor by damp. A single chair lay on its side. I sat against the wall and listened to the rain drum overhead, telling myself no one would follow me this far. At some point, exhaustion took me. I woke in pitch dark, the sound of rain replaced by silence. My breath fogged in the cold air, and then I noticed the chair. It wasn't on its side anymore. It stood upright in the middle of the shack. Balanced across its seat was my flashlight. I didn't scream. I didn't move. I just sat there, heart pounding, staring at that chair until my vision blurred. Someone had come in while I slept. Again, when dawn finally bled through the gaps in the roof, I grabbed my pack and didn't look back. I hiked until my knees buckled, until I reached a road with faded paint lines and collapsed against the asphalt. I don't tell this story often. People ask why I still backpack after that, why not go back to the mountains at all. I never really have an answer. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that trail marker, the knife, the chair. None of it made sense then. It doesn't now. The only thing I know is this: someone out there walked through my camps while I slept, and they wanted me to remember them. I grew up in West Virginia, so camping in the Appalachians wasn't unusual for me. My girlfriend, Emma, had lived most of her life in towns and suburbs, but she loved the idea of spending a weekend away from traffic and phone service. I thought it would be good for both of us. A small, cheap escape from everything. We set up our tent near a hollow where a narrow stream trickled through mossy rocks. The trees were so thick that the light dimmed by late afternoon, and the ground smelled like wet leaves and iron-rich mud. Our fire crackled weakly, and smoke curled into the mist that always seemed to sit low between the trees. By the time we finished dinner, it was dark. The night in those woods felt heavier than the kind of dark you get in the city. You can almost taste it, thick like damp soil. The cicadas and frogs carried on, and every now and then, I'd hear something larger moving through the undergrowth, a deer maybe, or something rooting for food. Around midnight, just as the fire was dying, Emma froze. I noticed her head cock slightly, her eyes narrowing. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. I didn't at first. Then, as the woods quieted, I caught it too, a faint, high-pitched sound. Not an animal, not wind. It was crying. A woman's voice, thin and broken, like someone trying to muffle sobs. We sat there for a long time, listening. It seemed to come from deep in the hollow, far enough that I couldn't pinpoint direction, but close enough that every hair on my arm stood up. Emma whispered that we should call out, see if someone was hurt. I told her no. Something about it wasn't right. It didn't sound panicked or sudden. It was steady, stretched out, like whoever it was had been crying for hours. The sound would fade, then return. Sometimes it sounded closer, sometimes farther, but never approaching in a way that made sense. Just shifting, as though it were moving in circles out beyond the trees. We whispered arguments back and forth. Should we leave the tent light on? Should we walk down the dirt road and try to find help? But it was miles to the nearest town, and we'd seen no one else all day. The thought of walking blind into the woods in the middle of the night to chase a crying voice made my chest feel tight. So we sat, for hours, listening. Every few minutes, Emma would grip my arm tighter, asking if it was closer now, or if I thought it might be some kind of animal. I didn't know what to tell her. When the crying finally stopped, it was almost worse. The silence was so sudden, it felt intentional. I could hear only the fire popping softly, and my own breath. I didn't sleep at all that night. I lay in the tent, staring at the nylon walls, every crunch of leaves outside making my stomach twist. At first light, I crawled out. The ground was damp, and the fog hung low between the trees. My boots sank into soft mud as I walked a few steps around the tent. That's when I noticed the branches. Thin twigs and sticks, broken, bent downward, ran in a faint but visible line around the perimeter of our tent. Not random scatter, not fallen from wind. Each break was fresh, white wood exposed. The line wasn't straight, but curved in a wide circle. Emma stepped out, rubbing her arms against the chill. She saw it too. A ring of broken branches, like someone or something had walked around us, carefully, again and again, while we sat inside listening. Neither of us said anything, but I could see the same thought on her face that was already in my mind. We hadn't imagined it. Something had been there, and it knew exactly where we were. We tried to pack up, but it was clumsy and rushed. My hands kept fumbling, and Emma snapped at me more than once, her nerves raw from the night before. The ground was still wet from dew, our gear heavy with it. We carried everything back to the car, but the feeling didn't lift. On the drive down the narrow gravel road, the woods pressed in on both sides, the trees tall and crooked, their bark slick with moss. The crying was gone, but I couldn't shake the memory of it, thin and steady in the dark. Halfway down, Emma asked me to pull over. She had spotted something through the trees, a cabin, set back off the road. The roof sagged and half the windows were broken, but smoke-stained boards and a rusted metal chair on the porch suggested it hadn't been abandoned all that long. I told her we should keep going, but she was curious. Maybe someone had been living out there. Maybe someone was living out there. Against my better judgment, we walked up the muddy path. The closer we got, the worse it smelled, like mildew, wet wood, and something sour underneath. The door was cracked open, sagging on one hinge. Inside, the air was heavy, damp. Furniture sat in odd places, like it had been dragged and abandoned. On a low table was a lantern, long since burned out. Beside it lay a blanket folded neatly, though it was damp with mold, and on the wall, crookedly nailed into splintering wood, were photographs. Old, faded photographs of people I didn't recognize. Most were black and white, some color, families, children, all standing stiff in front of houses or barns. The eyes seemed wrong, not because of anything supernatural, just because someone had tacked them up in this half-rotten cabin miles from anywhere. Emma whispered that we should leave, and I agreed. But before we turned, I noticed something near the window. A branch, broken, fresh, the same as the ones that had circled our tent, set carefully on the sill, as though placed there. The drive back into town felt endless. We said little, both of us watching the trees slide past in silence. When we finally reached a gas station, the clerk told us the nearest house was 10 miles east, across 2 ridges. No one lived anywhere near where we had camped. That night, lying in my own bed, I thought about the crying. The steady rhythm of it, not desperate, not even loud. Just enough to keep us awake. Just enough to keep us listening. I still hear it sometimes when I wake in the middle of the night, faint, steady, like someone just out of sight, circling. And I think about those broken branches, how carefully they had been snapped, not scattered, not accidental, as if whoever, or whatever, it was wanted us to know we'd been chosen, not to attack, not even to speak, just to let us know that they were there, and that they had walked in circles, watching us, while we sat frozen in the dark. I've always liked the quiet of night fishing. There's something about the way a lake in the mountains swallows sound, how even a small splash feels like it echoes forever across the water. That night in late October, I set up camp near a place called Buck Hollow, deep in the Appalachian foothills of Western Virginia. The town nearest to it, Clifton Forge, was 20 miles back the way I came, and I hadn't seen another car since turning down the Forest Service road. The air was damp, carrying that smell of wet leaves and cold earth. I pitched my tent a few yards from the shoreline, just far enough from the water to avoid waking up soaked in dew. By the time I had a small fire going, fog was already rolling low across the surface of the lake, shifting like breath over glass. Around 9, I strung my line and walked down to the rocks by the water. The only sounds were the creak of branches overhead and the occasional ripple out on the lake. The beam of my headlamp would catch the fog, flattening everything around me into a pale gray wall. It was the kind of silence where your thoughts get loud, where every crackle in the brush feels heavier than it should. I stayed out there for about 2 hours. Didn't catch a thing, but that wasn't really the point. I just liked being there, listening to the stillness. When I finally walked back up the path toward my tent, I noticed the fire I'd left smoldering had died out completely, though I remembered banking it before I left. Then I saw the tent. The zipper was open halfway down, the flap sagging forward. For a second, I thought maybe I'd forgotten to close it tight, but when I ducked inside, my stomach sank. My sleeping bag wasn't crumpled where I'd left it. It was neatly folded, squared off and placed at the foot of the tent. My backpack had been dumped out across the tarp floor, gear scattered like someone had gone through each pocket carefully. My boots had been moved closer to the tent door, their laces undone. Nothing was missing. Not my wallet, not my flashlight, not the knife I kept in the side pouch. Whoever had been in there, they hadn't taken a thing. They'd just rearranged. I stood there in the damp air, listening. The forest was dead quiet, not even crickets. I told myself maybe a raccoon had nosed its way in, but deep down I knew it wasn't that. Raccoons don't fold sleeping bags. They don't unzip tents halfway down. I tried to shake it off. I gathered my stuff, stuffed everything back into my pack, and laid the sleeping bag out again. But I couldn't make myself get in. I sat outside the tent instead, staring into the fog as it curled off the lake. That's when I saw them. On the side of the tent, smeared into the damp fabric, were handprints, muddy, streaked clear as day in the glow of my headlamp. The prints were too large to be mine. The fingers longer, the palms broader. They looked fresh, pressed into the fabric with weight, like someone had leaned against the tent and listened. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, the fog hadn't lifted. It clung to the trees in pale strips, and everything smelled of wet rot. I boiled water for coffee, though I barely tasted it. My eyes kept drifting back to those handprints, drying now to faint brown smudges. I packed slow. Something about leaving too quickly felt wrong, like it would mean acknowledging that I'd been afraid. But I couldn't shake the thought that whoever, or whatever had been there might still be close. I decided to hike a ridge trail above the lake before heading out, more to clear my head than anything. The path wound steep and narrow, lined with slick rocks and twisted pines. Every so often, I'd hear something moving off trail, but when I stopped, the sound would die instantly. About half a mile up, I came across a small clearing. In the middle sat the skeleton of a hunting cabin, collapsed roof, half its boards rotted through, moss climbing the walls. The air inside smelled of mildew and wet ash, like a fire long gone out. I don't know why I went in. Curiosity, maybe, or the need to prove to myself that nothing was out here but trees and old wood. The floor sagged under my weight. In the corner, I found a pile of objects, things too random to belong together. A rusted coffee tin, a child's shoe, a stack of newspapers from the 1980s, their edges curled and soft. But what froze me was the sleeping bag. It was nearly identical to mine. Same forest green canvas shell, same faded zipper. It had been folded with care, tucked into the corner like someone had prepared it for later. Next to it was a backpack, emptied, its contents scattered in neat rows on the floor. A water bottle, a cracked compass, a pocket knife without its blade. The sight hit me in the chest. It wasn't just similar, it was the same arrangement as my own gear had been the night before. I backed out fast, stumbling over the threshold. My throat was dry, but my hands were wet with sweat. On the way down the trail, I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder. Every tree felt closer than it had been, every patch of fog heavier. When I finally broke out onto the lakeshore again, the tent stood where I left it, but I couldn't make myself go near. The handprints seemed darker now, like they'd bled back through the fabric. I didn't fish again. I tore the tent down in minutes, stuffed everything into the trunk of my car, and drove until the forest thinned and the road widened. I didn't breathe right until I hit the lights of Clifton Forge. It's been 6 years since that trip. I haven't camped once since then. I still fish sometimes, but only on crowded piers, where voices carry and someone's always watching. I don't tell this story much, but when I do, people always ask the same thing. Do you think it was a person? And the truth is, I don't know. What I do know is that every so often, in the middle of the night, I'll wake up with the sense that someone has been in my room, not taking, not harming, just rearranging. The way my shoes aren't quite where I left them. The way a book I was halfway through lies neatly closed, and I can never shake the memory of those muddy handprints on the tent, too large to be mine. I've spent most of my life in North Carolina, and I've always felt pulled toward the Blue Ridge. I grew up fishing streams that ran through rhododendron thickets, camping along ridges where the fog rolls in so thick you can barely see your boots. But this trip felt different from the start. There were 4 of us, me, Tyler, and 2 brothers we knew from school, Aaron and Luke. We weren't at a campsite or trail marker. We'd gone off trail, down into a hollow near Black Balsam, where the map just showed a smear of green. Tyler insisted it would be more real that way, more isolated. He liked that idea. No cars, no hikers, no one stumbling across us. The ground was wet with old rain, and the smell of leaf rot clung to everything. Our tent stakes sank too easily into the earth. There were deer tracks along the ridge, fresh ones, and I remember Aaron pointing at them and saying quietly, "Could be something bigger." He meant bear, but he didn't push it. We settled in just before dusk. The woods got quiet in that way. Appalachia does. No traffic hum, no far-off dogs barking, just a steady silence broken by the occasional whippoorwill. The fire crackled, smoke pushing through the damp air. That first night, after the fire burned low and we'd all crawled into our tents, I heard it for the first time. A faint metallic clink, like a chain tightening, not loud, just enough to prick at the silence. I lay there, staring at the nylon ceiling, thinking maybe it was a branch creaking in the wind. But the night was still. The sound came again, then again, a slow rhythm, metal on metal, but distant. I didn't say anything until the next morning. Tyler had heard it too, so had Aaron. Sounded like tools, Aaron muttered while we boiled water for coffee. He rubbed his hands together like he was cold. Like somebody working out here. We joked that maybe it was an old prospector, a ghost swinging a pickaxe. Nobody laughed too hard. The second night, the clinking came again. Later, closer. Luke unzipped the tent and whispered for us to come out. The four of us stood in the cold with our breath fogging, listening. The sound seemed to move in a slow circle around camp. Probably nothing, Tyler whispered, but his voice wasn't steady. He picked up a stick like it would help. We followed it a short distance, stumbling over roots, our flashlights throwing weak beams into the fog. The sound stopped as soon as we moved deeper. Just stopped, like it had been waiting for us to listen. We stood there for a while, shivering, until Aaron swore under his breath and turned back. The next morning, while gathering firewood, I noticed something I swear hadn't been there before. Not 50 feet from our tents, half hidden under ferns and damp leaves, was a rusted iron trap. A bear trap, heavy and wide, its teeth brown with age. The chain was still attached, half buried in the mud. I froze. The thing looked old, but not ancient. The metal wasn't crumbling. It was just weathered, like it had been waiting. The others came over, one by one. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Finally Luke said, "That wasn't here yesterday." We all nodded because we knew it wasn't. The trap sat there like a mouth ready to snap shut. I kept circling it, looking at the ground around it. No prints, no shovel marks, nothing to suggest someone had just set it. Just the wet leaves and dark soil of the hollow. Tyler crouched beside it. "Illegal to set these," he said quietly, almost to himself. "They've been banned for years." He reached out like he might touch it, then thought better of it. Aaron swore and kicked at the mud. We didn't miss this. No way. That was the problem. We'd cleared this patch when we set up. Picked sticks, leveled the ground, looked around for rocks. We would have seen it. The rest of the day passed in a strange haze. Nobody said much. Even Tyler, who usually never shut up, barely spoke. We just kept noticing how close it had been to where we slept. That night, the fog was so thick you couldn't see the trees past the firelight. I kept glancing into it, expecting to see a shadow moving. The clinking came again, faint, further off this time. We didn't go after it. I remember lying in the tent, hearing Aaron breathe fast and shallow beside me, when it hit me that the sound wasn't moving randomly. It was circling, always circling, like it was tracing a boundary around us. The fourth morning, I woke early and stepped out into the cold. The trap was gone. I stood there staring at the spot where it had been, my stomach turning. The leaves were disturbed, mud slicked over, but the trap itself was gone. When the others woke up, I told them. Nobody argued. Nobody accused anyone else of moving it. We all just looked at each other, pale and tired, like we already knew what it meant. We packed fast. None of us said the word leave, but we did it anyway. Rolled damp tents, stuffed gear half-assed into bags, left the fire pit smoking. I kept feeling like we were being watched. The hike out was slow, every branch crack making us flinch. We didn't talk until we hit the gravel road that led back toward town. That's when Luke said it, his voice low. Somebody wanted us to find it. I didn't answer. It's been years since that trip, but I still dream about the sound. That slow, patient clink, like someone dragging a chain through the leaves. I dream about the trap waiting just beyond the firelight, its teeth wide open. Sometimes I wake up, convinced it's still out there, buried again, moved again. And sometimes, when the night's quiet enough, I think I hear it outside my window. Just a faint metallic sound, too steady to be the wind, like someone reminding me they know where I sleep. I had driven deep into the Appalachian Mountains to clear my head. That summer, my life felt like it had collapsed in on itself. I'd walked away from my job, my relationship, and the claustrophobic apartment I'd been wasting away in. A friend of mine from college had a small plot of land near an old coal town in West Virginia, and he told me I could use it if I wanted to be alone for a while. It wasn't much, just a patch of forest, a sloping ridge above a hollow where the fog never seemed to lift. There was a sagging shed and a few rusted-out barrels, but no proper house. I brought a hammock, a tarp, and some food. I told myself it would feel freeing, like shedding skin. The woods were quiet in a way that made me aware of every sound. During the day, it was just cicadas, the occasional woodpecker, and the distant groan of trucks on some road I couldn't see. At night, though, it was different. The trees pressed closer. You'd hear shifting soil, branches snapping too close for comfort. I tried to tell myself it was deer, maybe a stray dog. That third night, I'd tied my hammock between two maples and let the tarp sag low against the misty drizzle. I fell asleep, listening to the rain tapping the nylon. Sometime deep in the night, I woke up, not from a sound exactly, but from a presence. The air had gone still. The rain stopped, and then I heard it. A soft humming, low, drawn-out notes, right beneath me. I froze. I thought maybe it was in my head, but the tone wavered, like someone holding it in the back of their throat. The sound was close, directly below, as if the person were standing under the hammock, looking up at me through the dark. I held my breath. My chest ached, but I didn't move. The humming went on for maybe 20 seconds, though it stretched in my mind like an hour. Then it faded, cut off, mid-note, like someone shutting their mouth tight. The woods fell back into silence. I stayed awake until dawn, clutching my knife, staring at the curve of the tarp above me. When the light finally seeped through the trees, pale and gray, I leaned over the side. My feet brushed damp air, the leaves below still wet from the rain. That's when I saw it. Directly under where my body had been hanging, half sunk in the mud, was a cigarette butt. The paper still stained with spit. The end was dark, but when I picked it up with a stick, it gave off a faint warmth. Someone had been standing beneath me, not long before the sun came up. I didn't smoke. Nobody I knew smoked out here. And I couldn't shake the feeling that while I'd been suspended in that hammock, trying not to breathe, someone had been standing in the fog, humming to themselves, watching me. I told myself it didn't mean anything. Maybe it was old. Maybe it had just felt warm because the mud held heat from the day before. Still, I couldn't ignore the detail. It had been right under me, exactly where I'd heard the humming. I almost packed up right then, but I didn't. I don't know why. Pride, maybe. Or the thought of driving all the way back into town, trying to explain to someone at a diner that I'd gotten spooked by a cigarette. I convinced myself to stay one more night. I moved the hammock deeper into the trees, further from the shed and the old barrels. I tried to cook something on my camp stove, but the metallic tang of the shed drifted with the fog, sour and rotten, and I lost my appetite. That evening, I walked around the clearing. I kept finding things I hadn't noticed before. A crushed beer can under the shed. A pair of boot prints in the mud, softened by rain, but still visible, larger than mine. And on the inside wall of the shed, faint in the warped wood, were blackened streaks, like someone had tried to start a fire and put it out with their hand. The longer I looked, the more I wondered if anyone had really left this land abandoned. I stayed awake late into the night, reading by headlamp, jumping at every rustle in the leaves. At some point I must have drifted off, because when I opened my eyes again, the woods were silent. Dead silent. No insects, no owls, just my pulse. I waited, and then it came again, not humming this time. A whistle, low, off-key, 2 short notes, like someone calling a dog. It came from the hollow, rose up through the trees, and stopped. I felt something tighten in my throat. I slipped out of the hammock and crouched low, clutching my knife. The fog pressed thick around the trees, swallowing everything beyond a few feet. For a long time, nothing, just mist and silence. And then faintly, from the direction of the shed, the smell of cigarette smoke. Not old, fresh. I could taste it on the back of my tongue. I didn't move the rest of the night. At dawn, when the light was weak but steady, I forced myself back to the clearing. The shed's door was cracked open. I was sure I'd left it shut. Inside, the dirt floor was scattered with cigarette butts. Some crushed, some just dropped. A few looked recent, ash still intact. In the corner, there was a flattened piece of cardboard, with an indentation, like someone had been sitting there night after night, smoking and watching. That was the moment I realized I hadn't been alone since I arrived. I left everything, the hammock, the tarp, the food. I walked straight to my car, and didn't look back. Even driving down that twisting mountain road, I felt eyes on me, like someone was still humming under their breath. Just soft enough that I couldn't prove it was there. It's been months now, but the smell of stale smoke still makes my skin crawl. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, certain I hear that low whistle outside my window. I never told my friend what I found on his lens. I don't think he wants to know, but I can't stop thinking about it. The cigarette that was still warm. Whoever was under my hammock that night wasn't passing through. They'd been there, and for a while I think they planned on staying. I had been looking forward to that trip for months. Work had been draining me dry, and when my old college friends suggested a few days of camping in the Appalachians, I jumped at the chance. I pictured cool nights around a fire, cheap whiskey passed around in plastic cups, and long trails where the air smelled like pine and earth instead of printer toner. We picked a hollow near a stream, just outside a town called Buckhorn. The road in was half gravel, half mud, and the cabin we passed on the way looked like it had been abandoned for decades. Roof sagging, porch covered in moss, windows either boarded or shattered. The kind of place you'd see from the road and wonder who once lived there and why they left. By the time we pitched our tents, the fog had already started to creep down the valley. It rolled over the tree line like smoke, filling every low dip in the ground. The fire sputtered against the damp air, but we managed to keep it going long enough for hot dogs and cheap beer. Everyone else turned in early, leaving the fire to die out. I laid in my sleeping bag, listening to the slow drip of condensation falling from the trees. The air was heavy with the smell of wet leaves and wood smoke. I must have been half asleep when the pressure in my bladder forced me up. The woods were silent, except for the trickle of water from the stream. I pulled on my boots and stepped out into the fog. The beam of my flashlight was weak and yellow, swallowed almost immediately by the mist. That's when I saw it. Not far ahead, maybe 50 yards into the trees, a faint glow pulsed through the fog. At first I thought it was another group of campers, a lantern maybe. But the light didn't sway or flicker the way a lantern would. It looked steady, low, like something burning close to the ground. Curiosity got the better of me. I left the trail, my boots sinking into damp moss and soft earth, and moved toward it. The smell of smoke got stronger, but it wasn't the sharp bite of a campfire. It was softer, waxy, like melted candles. When the fog parted, my stomach went cold. In a small clearing, dozens of candles had been placed in a perfect circle, each one burning low, their flames hardly disturbed by the damp air. Some were tall, some stubby, but all of them had been arranged carefully, deliberately. The circle was wide enough that I could have stood in the middle with my arms stretched and not touched a single one. The wax pooled onto flat stones beneath them, as though someone had been here for hours, tending them, making sure they stayed lit. But there was no one there. No voices, no movement, just the faint hiss of wax dripping onto cold stone. I felt a wave of unease crawl up my spine. The woods seemed suddenly too quiet, the fog pressing in heavier. My instinct told me not to linger, so I backed away, keeping my flashlight low. By the time I returned to camp, I was breathing fast. I shook one of my friends awake, Marcus, and told him he had to come see. He grumbled, but when he saw my expression, he pulled on his jacket and followed me. We hurried back through the fog, retracing my steps, but when we reached the clearing, my chest tightened in confusion. The circle was still there, the stones, the melted wax, but every candle had been snuffed out. Smoke lingered faintly in the air, the kind that lingers after you blow out a candle at home. But the clearing itself was dark, empty, silent. Marcus squinted at me, clearly annoyed. So, somebody probably left him. He kicked one of the cold stones. You dragged me out here for this? I didn't answer. I just stood there, staring at the still warm wax that had pooled like blood around the base of the candles, my skin crawling with the sense that we weren't supposed to be there. When we got back to camp, I couldn't sleep. The image of those flames, burning alone in the fog, kept replaying in my mind. And the question that gnawed at me the hardest was the simplest one. Why had they gone out the moment I left? The next morning, no one believed me. Marcus brushed it off as me spooking myself, and the others teased me about watching too many scary movies. I didn't argue. I didn't tell them about how the wax was still warm, or how the smoke had hung in the air like the breath of something unseen. We went about the day, fishing, hiking, passing around a flask, but the woods felt different to me now. Every time I saw a break in the fog, or the shadow of the valley walls, I wondered if someone was watching us. That night, when everyone else was asleep, I lay awake listening. The forest had its usual sounds, crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, but beneath that was something harder to place. A faint shuffle, like boots dragging across wet leaves, too deliberate to be in an animal. I sat up, straining my ears. The sound circled our camp slowly, just outside the reach of the dying firelight. I told myself it was just deer, maybe a black bear nosing around. But no animal I knew moved like that, slow, pacing, as though measuring the distance. I almost woke Marcus again, but stopped. What if I was wrong? What if it was nothing? At some point, I must have dozed, because when I opened my eyes, the fire was out, and the fog was thick again. The silence was so heavy it pressed against my ears. I turned my head toward the woods, and I froze. Out past the tree line, faint pinpricks of light burned through the fog, dozens of them. But they weren't scattered like stars. They were arranged, low to the ground, spread wide, the exact shape I'd seen the night before. Candles. The circle again. I couldn't move. My body refused. All I could do was watch as the faint glow trembled in the fog, far enough that I couldn't see details, but close enough that I knew it was real. Then one by one, they went out, not all at once, but in sequence, as though someone was walking the circle, snuffing each flame deliberately. The fog swallowed the last faint glow, leaving nothing but black. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the sun came up, the others laughed at how pale I looked. They packed up slowly, hungover and careless, while I kept glancing back at the tree line. I thought about saying something, about begging them to hurry, but the words stayed stuck in my throat. We drove out down that muddy road, past the sagging cabin with its broken windows, past the mist still clinging to the hollows. I didn't look back. It's been years since that trip. Marcus still brings it up sometimes, mocking me about my candle cult story. Everyone laughs, and I fake a smile, but the truth is I don't camp anymore. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I dream of that clearing. I see the circle of stones, the wax pooled dark on their surfaces. I see the flames, trembling in the fog, and I wake with the distinct feeling that somewhere, deep in those woods, the candles are still burning, just waiting for someone to step inside the circle.